Before we begin, please subscribe to our new channels, David on China and David Zhang 360, as China Insider has been demonetized. You can search David on China or David Zhang 360 on YouTube with no space, or simply click the links in the description. The issue of forced organ harvesting and the possibility of being killed on demand for their organs. Today I'm speaking with the author of the new book Kill to Order, Mr. Jekielek, who is the senior editor of the Epoch Times and the host of American Thought Leaders. Jekielek, it's such a pleasure to welcome you to China Insider, and it's great to talk to you about your new book, not my book, Kill to Order. Thank you very much for coming on.
David, I'm thrilled to be here. I love your show. Watch it all the time. You've got some really incredible analysis. Seriously.
Thank you. So yeah, before we begin to talk about the book, let's first talk about the upcoming event that's happening in DC, which I'll be attending. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, something incredible actually happened. So our publisher, or my publisher, Tony Lyons over at Skyhorse, he had this idea. Let's do a big book opening at Trump Kennedy Center. And I thought it was kind of crazy because usually, you do it at someone's home or a small venue. But anyway, all of this actually transpired. Initially, we were going to be in this theater, okay, with 1,000 people, which I thought was really daunting. But actually, there are quite a lot of people are now basically have RSVP'd for that. But they've actually upgraded us to the concert hall. Okay, so we're actually like in one of these premier venues in America, right? Rob Schneider and myself. Rob has gotten behind this issue. God bless him. He's amazing, and he's even figured out how to do a little bit of comedy around it, which I didn't even think was possible, right? But it actually is. We're actually working on that as we speak. And we're going to hit some really heavy issues, but also we're going to try to do it with a little bit of a lighter heart at certain moments. And it's going to be an amazing group of people. And of course, David, you're going to be one of our, VIPs in the after party. There's actually Kennedy Center has also organized an after party on the terrace on the rooftop. It's going to be unbelievable. KilledToOrderEvent.com, KilledToOrderEvent.com. You can go there and, RSVP, and we've got 2,000 places, a little less now, but still quite a few, I think, available before Monday the 16th, 6 p.m.
Yeah, so guys, I'll be there if you're around in the DC area, or if you're even traveling down for the week, maybe come down and say hi, and you can meet myself and Jan in person, and maybe even get a copy of his book. I believe it's the first 1,000 reservations. Yeah. You do get a copy, right? Yeah.
Well, there's also like a very generous donor who just loved the book so much that he said, look, I'm going to do this. I want people to be reading this book. So the first 1,000 people in the door get a book.
Awesome. So Jan, you have a show where you get to interview, it's called American Thought Leaders, and you get to interview a wide range of people on different topics every time. So what made you want to focus specifically on the issue of forced organ harvesting in China?
Well, so this is actually an issue that I've been covering for the better part of 20 years. So to backtrack a little bit, I worked on, you could call it China human rights, okay? Most recently, as I kind of started to transition into journalism, I was working on this underground railroad. Basically, Chinese religious dissidents, prisoners of conscience, including Falun Gong practitioners, were coming through China, through the Golden Triangle. It's this treacherous area where Laos and Cambodia and Thailand all come together. They're coming through there and ending up in Bangkok, in a relatively safe place, but not entirely safe, because the Chinese Communist Party would pressure the Thais, but the Thais also wanted to have good relationships with the Americans. But basically, once these people got there, they could get UN refugee status. But also what could happen is they could get deported back to China, and the Chinese government would put lots of pressure for that to happen. So we were there on the ground. Our job wasn't going through the treacherous part of the triangle. I wish I could say we were that part of the railroad. No, we were the people that were making sure that those people never got sent back to China, because that would be, they would just be disappeared immediately, most likely. So that's where it started. And I ended up traveling to a few other places. I was considering working with the International Society for Human Rights. I was in Poland. I'm a Polish native speaker. And I got this call, right? It was very strange. Basically, I was told, and I'd been hearing about rumors of this organ harvesting in China. I'd seen a little bit of evidence, but I got a call, and I was basically told 10,000 people in Israel had signed a petition to expose forced organ harvesting at Auschwitz. And so then I had to kind of sit down and look, wait, have I been missing this? What evidence is there out there, right? there were kind of two simultaneous bits of evidence that were coming out. One was, we were just hearing about, I don't think we had published on it yet. It was this whistleblower named Annie, whose surgeon husband had extracted 2,000 corneas from living people. That's what he confessed to her, and she decided she had to come out and talk about it. Okay, so that was one side. The other side was in Israel. There was the head of the Israeli Transplant Association, or former head, professor of surgery, heart surgeon. He had a patient who actually told him, "I'm tired of waiting. I've got a deal in China. In 2 weeks, I'm going to get my heart, and it's scheduled." And Jakob, being the child of Holocaust survivors, couldn't really believe it. What do you mean scheduled? Like, what do you mean? You know when someone's going to be dead to give you that heart? But the guy goes and gets the heart and comes back, right? And that's when Dr. Jacob Levy becomes this activist, and he enacts some of the first laws against this, actually, in Israel in 2008. But so all of this is kind of happening simultaneously. And this was one of the craziest moments in my life. I get asked, "Hey, can you help set this up? You speak Polish, right? Let's set this up at Auschwitz." And Auschwitz is a museum. They're very careful about, what they showcase there, right? They want to be very respectful to the Holocaust and so forth, right? So anyway, I went and I go to the director of education at the museum, and it was surreal because, my name, I don't know if you can, you pronounce it better than most people, let me just say, okay? And even Poles misspell it, okay? But in this one place in the world, the guy looks at me and he says, I say, Cześć, Jan Jekielek, and he says, "Oh, jakie to swojskie nazwisko," right? Which means, and it's hard to translate this word, but it basically means how unbelievably familiar and warm and close to me you feel because of your last name. Okay, because my last name comes from the region where the Germans actually built that camp. And it's a very small area, right? And so immediately we had this bond, and we were actually able to do this press conference on this issue at the Center of Dialogue and Prayer at Auschwitz. So it was kind of an amazing experience and quirk of fate or providence. I don't know how you would call it, but that's what got me into it. Really, that was the moment when I just kind of dove in, because I realized this is unbelievable. Like, the Island film had just come out the year before, I believe, right? It was like, I don't know if you remember that, kind of like a big Michael Bay, big thing with clones. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff, people were thinking of. And suddenly I realized, oh my God, no, this is a real thing. People are being killed in numbers, right, for organs, and with short wait times. The implications of the short wait times were massive, right? And then that's when a whole bunch of people went to work and did a lot of deep dive research. And I've just been mainly reporting on all of that and bringing some inferences out. And I bring that all together, 20 years of that work on and off in Killed to Order, this book at killedtoorder.com, by the way, if you're interested. Yeah.
So Jan, the one of the, I guess you could call it, the great figures in this field of in the research, but also the advocacy part, is the late David Kilgore, who I actually had the opportunity to interview once before he passed away. I remember the feeling of hearing this the first time, because you were involved in this quite early and I wasn't until, when I started this channel, was the unbelievable, or the hard to believe aspect of it, right? Because you in your opening imagery in your book, you kind of painted this picture, which was, for me, when I read it, I won't spoil too much, but basically when I read that part, and it felt like this is more of a Hollywood script rather than something that could possibly happen in real life. So could you kind of spell that out for us? Like, why was it necessary to have this character in the beginning of your book?
Well, okay. So let me just lay out what it is, okay? Just in short form, because I think a lot of people, when they think of organ harvesting, they think of black market, someone wakes up on ice, cut in their side, missing a kidney, something like that, right? Yeah. And actually this type of stuff does happen, and there's black market organ rings all around the world in different places, right? Unfortunately, it's horrible in itself, but this is this is next level. And why is it next level? Well, it's a unique situation where there's a state actor, okay, the Chinese Communist Party, is able to push massive coercive power through the population, through the Chinese population. And they can do two things. One is they can propagandize people massively. They hold all of the tools of information, pushing information through the system, this so-called media right there. very powerful, and a sort of their own version of TikTok to Douyin, right? As you these days, right? So that's one side. The second part is that they're able to incarcerate a massive group of people. They have a massive state security apparatus. It's actually bigger than their military, if you can imagine, right? They're so committed to basically controlling their population. So back in 1999, and this is actually really important, this is what they did to the Falun Gong practitioners. There's always a kind of a black class. There's always a group that's being struggled against by the country that the Chinese Communist Party picks. Originally, back in the day, it was landowners, right? They wanted to take their land, so these people became the enemies, and it became legitimate to take their land, right? But here's the crazy thing is when you're propagandized heavily, right? It actually we have this weird quirk of psychology. It's an incredibly important part of the psychology of atrocity. This is something that I've been studying for quite a while. How do you get normal, decent people to do bad things to their neighbor, right? You have to kind of convince them that they're bad or dangerous or something. I mean, this is what the Germans did in the 1930s, right, to the Jewish people. So that same language was used when the Chinese Communist Party turned on the Falun Gong. I mean, I expect on your channel, many people will be familiar, but these were, 70 to 100 million people by government estimate practicing truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, actually in many cases, seen as sort of particularly good citizens, right? And so forth. Suddenly everyone had to believe that they're enemies of the state or evil or something like that. So they pushed this massive coercive propaganda through the system, right? Basically to demonize these people, but also to make sure that everybody else knows these people are the enemy. These people are the ones that the system is against now, and you don't want to be a part of that, right? Because you know what the party can do. You know how many people have died at the hands of the party. That's one part, right? The second part is they incarcerated a massive amount, okay? Maybe 1 million, maybe 2, we don't know. In 2005, the Special Rapporteur on Torture at the UN estimated that half of all of the people in the massive, massive incarceration system of the CCP were Falun Gong practitioners. So anyway, it was some incredibly huge group of people. And now this is how you can get this unique kill to order forced organ harvesting situation, okay? They start blood typing them, they start tissue typing them, they start organ scanning them, okay? And they create a database. And now when you have this database, okay, now what you can do is someone, in this case, this patient of Jakob Levy, right, can actually get an organ in 2 weeks. Why is that? Because the moment that the money is paid, that the transaction is started, that person's in a database. They have been pre-matched already to this person. And the moment the transaction is made, that person can be shipped and killed to order. And that's why the name of my book, the title of my book is Killed to Order. It's something that frankly, I couldn't have even conceived of, right, until I started seeing this research that the amazing David Matus, one of the original researchers, David Kilgore, may he rest in peace, another one of the original researchers, this is what they were able to figure out.
I thought it was interesting because in parts of your book, you do mention in details of, like you mentioned, I cover this on my channel, but not to the extent, I think, because there's so much to talk about. But one of the main point I think people really might be interested to know is what was the ultimate goal of the CCP to, like, why would they imprison so many Falun Gong practitioners, and why would they start something that essentially is, kill to order, right?
Well, so this is a massive, expansive question, okay? Because we have 2 parts here. No, but I want to answer this. Incredibly valuable, incredibly important. And I some of this I've even figured out basically pretty recently. Like why persecute Falun Gong practitioners in the first place, and why start kill to order, right? So let's do Falun Gong practitioners first. I always thought that it was a good enough reason, when I first sort of heard about this, that there were 70 to 100 million Falun Gong practitioners and only 60 million Communist Party members. And I knew because my parents escaped communist Poland. That's why I grew up in Canada. I knew that communism was bad, and I knew that it did bad things to people. I knew it was kind of jealous of other approaches to living, right? I knew all that, but I didn't fully grasp it, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so that was a good explanation. Another explanation, and this is going to sound kind of funny because I always assumed that world leaders wouldn't make decisions based on things like this until I kind of went to Washington, D.C., and I realized actually it's very common for leaders, political leaders, to make decisions based on things like this. But there was a lot of evidence that Jiang Zemin, who was the dictator at the time in China, was actually incredibly jealous of the founder of Falun Gong, whose name was Li Hongzhi. He kind of had this love of the people, so to speak, right? As something that he could never have, right? As the dictator. And, I actually think that is part of the reason why the Falun Gong got targeted specifically, in addition to the fact that they were bigger in numbers than the Communist Party. But I think the real reason, and this has really only dawned on me like over a decade into studying all this, right? See, Falun Gong is very unusual as a system. Like, people often say, is it a religion? I don't know. It's like, I have that same question myself, in a sense, because it doesn't function like a typical faith belief system. There's definitely faith and belief in the system, but it doesn't have a hierarchy, for example. So imagine there's like voluminous teachings written by Li Hongzhi, but there aren't a lot of what you would call rules, right? Rules would be something that probably every Falun Gong practitioner would agree on. So I'll give you an example. Okay. So one rule, as I would call it, would be that you can't collect money. You can't enrich yourself in any way from it. I think every Falun Gong practitioner would agree on that. Another one would be that there's no hierarchy in the system, right? Another one is that you don't put sort of bad things in your body like alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, whatever, and any of that kind of thing. Another one is that there's no worship of Li Hongzhi, of the master. Some people have this need to kind of do that sort of thing. This is sort of not allowed, actually, in Falun Gong, as best as I can understand it. So there's all these kind of elements. And another one, like, let's say, David, you're a great Falun Gong practitioner. I admire you. I want to just copy what you do, keep it simple for myself, right? Because I know you're doing it so well. I'm actually not allowed to do that. I have to study the teachings, and I have to figure out my own path through the teachings, right? And there's not even any member, there's nothing to join. There's no roster or membership. What makes you a Falun Gong practitioner is living the teachings, truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. So it's very, it struck me one day, and I get shivers up my spine right now, actually, just thinking about it, right? Because it's what if you were to design a system that could resist totalitarianism, that could resist massive coercive control? I think it would look something like this, right? I mean, because it fosters this unbelievable amount of individual agency. Of course, it also has this health benefits, which a lot of people became interested in as well. But it's a very, it's a system that really promotes free thinking. And communist systems hate free thinking. They want people to basically follow, And I mean, again, I know you've covered these kinds of questions on this show quite a bit. So I think, anyway, I think that's ultimately the reason, because the Falun Gong itself is just sort of in its inherent nature. It never wanted to be political. It has no interest in being political. In fact, for the first few years after this persecution began, the Falun Gong practitioners, they viewed it as like a big mistake. They would go appeal to the government and say, "Hey, listen, stop this! You've got this all wrong, right?" And in fact, because this is really bad for you, right? It's not just bad. Of course, it's horrible for us, but it's really bad for you to be doing this sort of thing, right? And it took some years before people realized, wait a sec, it's communism. It's that these people are not listening. They're not rational. They're just pushing this kind of communist stuff, and we have to explain that to people, right? So anyway, so that's the Falun Gong part. I mean, it's kind of amazing, right, when you think about it, right? And listen, David, there's millions of people as we speak going out, like literally at this moment, going out, talking to their fellow man, explaining to them that Falun Gong, I'm not an evil person, I'm a decent person. And by the way, let's talk about communism. Let's talk about how that's a bad system. There's a whole movement to quit the Communist Party and other organizations that are associated with it. It's a whole remarkable, amazing story in itself, which maybe for another show. But so that's one side. But then the kill to order part is, again, incredibly fascinating. And I got put on. So what brought it all together for me, like the why, how does this happen? There's a scholar at Stanford named Chenggang Xu. Okay, brilliant man. He was actually a very dedicated communist at one point, and he working in China, and he went out into the countryside trying to figure out how will communism apply in the countryside, because it's supposed to be a working man's thing, whatever. And let's just say that the authorities didn't like what he found. I don't know exactly what it was, but he ended up spending 10 years in prison and being treated horribly and all sorts of stuff, as happens to the true believer communists, by the way, very commonly in these systems as well. Something to read about if you hadn't heard about before, for those watching. But so Chenggang is trying to explain. He wrote this book recently called Institutional Genes. It's a tome. It's his magnum opus. It's unbelievable thing, right? The institutional genes are are the genes of communism. Like, how does that actually work? And specifically, at one point, he tries to understand, why did Soviet communism fail and Chinese communism succeed? And he realized it's something called, and his analysis is brilliant. And this is what made me realize how forced organ harvesting happened, okay, and how it grew so quickly, okay. Basically, it's something called regionally administered totalitarianism. He calls it RAT, okay, regionally. And so communism is obscenely hierarchical. I mean, I like saying it that way because it really is like the extreme of hierarchical that you could think of. That's what it is, okay, all the way from the top. And everyone's like, man, I better fulfill everything up there. By the way, that's one of the reasons why the statistic, you can never trust any statistics in China, right? Never mind that they're all propaganda, which is true. But like, if you're below on that pyramid and you can't deliver a statistic up the chain that doesn't match, you're going to be in big trouble. Okay. So anyway, that's a whole another interesting aspect of the system. But basically, in Soviet communism, it was very hard. Here's what you have to do, and it would go down the line. In China, the innovation was that you would only really pass down the let's say overall viewpoint. Like, I'll give you an example. Okay, one of the top 7 national priorities that Xi Jinping instituted, he elevated this one concept which they were applying called military civil fusion. I mean, basically, it means that anything that is a civil endeavor and corporate whatever, it has to also, if it has a military application, the military needs to be involved, right? And so that all he needed to do is say, this is one of the top 7 national priorities, and that meant that that everybody knows if that doesn't happen, if the military is not advised of something that has military potential, heads will roll. Okay, even though he didn't specifically tell everybody, here's exactly what you have to do. So with forced organ harvesting, now we're going back to 2000, right? We have, on the one hand, there was this directive, unwritten. I mean, the unwritten word Jiang Zemin used was eradicate them. Okay, and that didn't mean kill everybody necessarily. It meant what the Communist Party is best at, okay? Re-educate them, transform them, break them, get them to confess their sins against the party, all of that kind of stuff. That's what they had to do. If people did that, by the way, they could go home. And these people proved unusually resilient to this. This is part of the reason why so many were incarcerated. They didn't even imagine how strong these people's character was, right? They thought they could just kind of break them pretty easily, right? So that's kind of the first part. And the other part is that through this regionally administered totalitarianism, there was also a directive that they wanted to grow their transplant industry. That was well known, and actually it was functioning at a low level. And they were killing prisoners for organs. We even have a surgeon that confesses having done that before this massive scaling happened. But basically, all it took with this regionally administered totalitarianism system is one province, one place to realize, wait a sec, I've got a lot of Falun Gong incarcerated, and we're supposed to grow our transplant system. Wait a sec, win-win, right? In the twisted, amoral logic, right? Win-win, right? And suddenly, you're making a ton of money doing forced organ harvesting, okay? And then everybody on the outside is watching, seeing, hey, wait a sec, these guys are being unusually effective at implementing the overall vision of the top. We better get on that. There were even all these perverse incentive structures even to make sure that you were effective at both re-educating and basically eradicating Falun Gong. It was crazy, right? So what happens is this industry grows geometrically from the year 2000 to 2005, where it sort of plateaus. They built hundreds, they built thousands of hospitals. I mean, it's astonishing because in the world, not just in China, but in the world, the supply is always a lot less than the demand of organs, because in an ethical situation, someone has to have a catastrophic accident. They have to, the size of the organ has to match your blood type, your tissue type, your organs, it all has to sort of fit. Otherwise, your body will reject that, right? And of course, there's anti-rejection drugs and so forth. That's why it's so rare. That's why people have to wait for months or years in some cases to get their transplant. But here, in 2 weeks, you can get it, because they built this monstrous machine. And I theorize in the book about, I think I know who started this. And although you can kind of tell me when you read it whether you agree with me.
So it sounds like to me, this is something I noticed as a pattern, which is basically, and if you look at any of their state industries in telecom, or whether it's like electric cars, it seems like they give that direct order, and then whoever is the best at presenting it or reflecting that state directive, they start getting the funding. But specifically with the state industry on forced organ harvesting, it felt like it was more on the level of who can ruin these people the best, or who can, like you mentioned, the order was to eradicate them in different ways the best, right? And obviously there's that financial incentive too. So how profitable do you think this was at the height of it? Or maybe, it's still very profitable.
Well, so there's kind of two implied questions there, right? One of them is like, is it still happening? Right? We
Mm,
know, like, because there were ads online that said new heart in 2 weeks for X number of dollars prior to 2006, prior to us starting to report on this. Okay, so like this is already pretty sizable, right? Already pretty sizable. Back in 2016, Ethan Gutman, who's one of the heroes of this whole research around this issue, he actually testified in front of Congress about how he was kind of calculating the numbers, right? And he came up, actually, it's worth clipping that.
146 transplant facilities, ministry approved, meet that general description. That yields a back of the envelope answer. You can do it right here. Not 10,000, but over 50,000 transplants per year. Suppose we actually hold those same hospitals and transplant centers to the actual state minimum requirement of transplant activity, beds, surgical staff, and so on. 80 to 90,000 transplants per year. Yet how should we account for the emergence of Tianjin First Central Hospital, easily capable of 5,000 transplants per year? PLA 309 Military Hospital in Beijing, similar. Zhongshan Hospital. The list is extraordinary. A detailed examination yields an average of up to 2 transplants per day, over 100,000 transplants per year. Now, the figures I have given you are based on Chinese numbers, not from official statements, but sources like Nurses Weekly. To understand why organs are readily available, we need to briefly examine how harvesting evolved over time. In the 1980s, it was an opportunistic afterthought to a convict's execution. In the mid-1990s, medical vans and execution grounds became routine. Experimental live organ harvests were carried out on the execution grounds of Xinjiang. In 1997, following the Gulja massacre, a handful of political prisoners, Uyghur activists, were harvested for a handful of aging Chinese Communist Party cadres. Now, perhaps those organs were simply prizes seized in the fog of war. Perhaps the harvesting of prisoners of conscience could have ended there. But in 1999, state security launched the campaign to eliminate Falun Gong. By 2001, over 1 million Falun Gong incarcerated within the Laogai system were subject to retail organ testing, and Chinese military and civilian hospitals were ramping up their transplant facilities. By 2002, it was Select House Christians. By 2003, it was the Tibetans' turn. By 2005, economic opportunism had been replaced by 2 hidden hands: 5-year plan capitalism and the party's desire to kill off its internal enemies. The result was that a foreign organ tourist of means could purchase a tissue-matched organ within 2 weeks. Hardened criminals were harvested for organs. Transplant centers stood to make 60,000, 100,000 or more, but the rise of the Chinese transplant industry was built on the foundation of Falun Gong incarceration.
That he comes up with a number of 60 to 100,000. Okay, myself and Matthew Robertson, another one of the hero researchers, we kind of bring it down to 60 to 90,000, but I think his estimates are pretty credible. It's just that I like to be even more conservative. But that whole boundary, as you'll understand when you look at that clip, is actually, the whole thing is pretty conservative in terms of because we don't know the exact numbers. We don't know. It's not like the Chinese government publishes it, right? It's considered to be a state secret, right? But the key part in that testimony is that there were 146, he's estimating 146 hospitals that are functioning, that are doing this, okay, to make his calculation. And today, right, if using that calculation, if we take the mean, we're talking about a $9 billion industry. That's to answer your, so it's a sizable financial incentive, right? Obviously. And today, actually all of this, as we've been doing this research, as we've been revealing this stuff, a lot more and more of the information has gone underground. We do know that in 2014 and 2015, because nobody did anything with respect to, trying to stop this with respect to the Falun Gong, or not, almost nobody who did. They added the Uyghur people. They dehumanized a massive group of them. They're very isolated in the northwest of China, right? They incarcerated massive group of them, and they started working on them. So we know that happened. And another thing that we know is that today it's about 200 hospitals, okay, not 146. So I think, like, again, this is the exact numbers. I'd be lying to you if I told you I don't know it, but it looks like it has only increased. It's either at the same level or has increased since that time. And we're talking about today, right?
So I want to kind of just, this concept, I honestly think it was such an interesting one in your book, which was because everybody involved in this is, to some degrees, you could say it's they're complicit in the act, right? But at the same time, you mentioned like Anne's husband or Annie's husband, who against all of the things that the guilt, the shame, and everything else, he came out and he told this to his wife, and then who came out public with this. Do you think there's, and maybe you talk a lot about, or you mentioned about what would happen to the Jewish population during the Second World War too. Do you think it felt like to these people, especially the CCP officials, that there was some level of, it felt like they did this already, so they must continue to do it in order to sustain the system, because they know that eventually, if something, the CCP collapse, they will be the ones who were held responsible, like the trials in the aftermath of the Second World War.
It's a very weird thing, right? When you build a massive bureaucracy around something, whether it's an industrial one or otherwise, right? These types of systems become self-perpetuating at a certain scale. And I think that's honestly part of what happened, right? Part of it is your point is exactly right. Like, these are things that no one's ever going to admit to. It's a relatively easy thing to hide on the ground, because the crime scene is an operating room, right? Which is scrubbed. It's the most scrubbed clean place, like, anyway. Never, it's not like you have to specially go in and, hide the evidence. And because these people are so vulnerable, right? Remember, these are people that many people have not even gone through any trial or anything. They're just incarcerated, right? There's no rule of law there, right? There's no due process for most of them. So they're basically they just disappear. They're being tortured in horrible ways. I mean, in some cases. So people expect them to be disappearing or being shipped somewhere. And if they disappear, so be it. So to answer your question, I think, on the one hand, there's this massive machinery of the system that has been built. And that's why, when they said, they kind of pretended in 2015, like they started an actual organ registry, but researchers showed it to be a perfect quadratic equation. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was fraud, but not even particularly, just obvious fraud, not even particularly elegant. No attempt to hide it. It was weird almost, right, that way. But the problem is, when you have this machine that kills to order. I mean, look, there's a paper in the American Journal of Transplantation titled Execution by Organ Procurement, okay? This paper, in a nutshell, found 70 instances in the published peer-reviewed scientific literature where the dead donor rule had been violated. In other words, the extraction of the organs killed that person. Those people were murdered by having their organs extracted in those studies, right? So the way I read that is, it's just so normalized there that they've forgotten that this is even a problem. And that's the problem. When you build this massive machine bureaucracy thing around something, it's very hard to dismantle it, because there's a lot of money, a lot of people involved, a lot of people grafting off the top. The gravy train is good people, and everybody knows at some level that isn't a psychopath that they're committing a massive crime, and they absolutely never want to own up to it. So it just sort of has this sort of self-perpetuation, right? Like you point out, the psychology of that is fascinating, and something I actually want to learn more about.
I know we're running out of time, so I'll give you like the last portion of this to answer two questions. I'll combine them, because I thought you, in the end part of the book, you mentioned a lot of the counters to objections or possible questions around this topic, right? So one of them I mentioned, or I want to know is, people say that these are all just circumstantial evidence, like there's no direct evidence. So I wanted to know, what would you say to that? But also, what would be your most convincing evidence that you found or believe is the most convincing to you on this topic?
Well, just first of all, with atrocity, it's always very difficult to find direct evidence, because there's a lot of attempt to hide it. That's just normal. But aside from that, I think the body of evidence, first of all, ChinaTribunal.com, okay, 2 years of dedicated work looking at the entire body of evidence up until 2020. Very powerful, very compelling. So I would just recommend people go there and check it out. But just in terms of individual pieces of evidence, I think that execution by organ procurement paper is pretty compelling, because I don't really see any other explanation for that at all. And second of all, and there's actually a survivor, Cheng Pei-ming, as you know. I know you've talked about him on the show, and they actually admit to having done it to him. That's one of the most shocking parts about it is they say they did it for a different reason, but the guy's missing part of his liver and part of his lung. Like, I mean, so and then there's just, a whole lot of weird anecdotes, like one person confessing to have been fitted with 8 separate kidneys, that 7 of which got rejected, so there's, when you add all of this up, right? Actually, the final kind of most interesting, I would say, piece of evidence is the fact that the CCP has never offered an alternative story as to how these kinds of transplants can be happening as they are, right? So it's sort of like if you were doing something legitimately, you would just say, look, this is how we're doing it. You think you're wrong, right? Let's put this to rest. But all they ever do is attack the messenger and never provide any sort of compelling reason. So it's sort of have I seen is there video evidence? And there's a video crew that went undercover and talked to people and, and basically confirmed that this is happening, where it's able to source organs. That's from South Korea. And they phoned people and said, hey, can I get organs in 2 weeks? Absolutely, come on down. I mean, it all kind of goes on and on and on. But did someone ever walk into a room while someone's being organ harvested and videotape that? No, that has not happened. Okay, but I think the evidence is wildly compelling.
So Jan, thank you very much. In the last 30 seconds, maybe just shout out your book and where to get it and the upcoming event.
Thank you so much. Okay, so killedtoorder.com. We're trying to create a sort of a movement around this. This is kind of an issue where awareness actually makes a difference. People calling their senators, realizing this is real, getting motivated through that, making something as simple as a phone call, working with Rotary. There's a whole Rotary club, okay, that's committed to ending forced organ harvesting. Amazing thing. All over America, people can kind of participate. I'm just saying, this book, killedtoorder.com, is a kind of like a tool to encourage people to get interested, share it with their friends. If you actually find it compelling, and I think you will, because there's so much good stuff in there. Okay, the other part is killedtoorderevent.com. That's the event with Rob Schneider and myself at Trump Kennedy Center, Monday, March 16th, 6 p.m. We still have seats, I'm pretty darn sure, because we're in the concert hall. And we would love it to be, and of course I'm going to be hosting you, David, at the VIP, which I'm super excited about. After party afterwards. Come one, come all.
Perfect. Jan, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you guys for watching this interview.
Thanks a lot.